Good evening and welcome to everyone to the June edition of the Sprouts Lecture Series. Uh, it's our proud privilege to have Dr. Naveen Namboothri uh, for this edition of our lecture series. And it's our 10th year going on this lecture series. So we are very, very happy to be online and doing this session. Uh, I request Rahul Palekar to kindly introduce the lecture series, our host, and Dr. Naveen Namboothri.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. The Sprouts lecture series is a monthly lecture series. We are currently in our 10th year. It originally started as an offline event, that is, you had to be there in person in order to listen. And it started in Maharashtra Nature Park. And there have been numerous experts in the fields of environment, sustainability, who have come to deliver talks and basically update the general public on the different research they are doing and the experiences they have had in their fields, as well as it is a platform for open discourse so that people can ask any questions that they have had in their minds, and there is a free dialogue basically. So that is the purpose of the free lecture series. Ever since the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been having these talks online, which is a blessing because a lot of people have been able to attend from different countries, which was not the case earlier. And also, we have been able to bring on board many speakers from different cities and different countries. And we hope that this trend continues and more people join and participate in these talks. Now, I would like to thank our host, that is FES. FES, or Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, is a German organization. It the Friedrich Ebert was the first democratically elected president of Germany. FES works on the core ideas and values of social democracy, that is freedom, justice, and solidarity. It has been active in India since 1980s, building platforms building platforms for exchange of progressive discourses and fostering debates on national, regional, and global level. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Naveen Namboothri is a founder trustee of Dakshin Foundation, which is a not for profit NGO committed to environmental sustainability and social justice. Its mission is to inform and advocate for conservation and natural resource management while promoting and supporting sustainable livelihoods, social development, and environmental justice. Dr. Namboothri currently serves as the director at Dakshin. Trained as a marine biologist, he has worked in a diverse coastal, marine, and island systems across India. He heads the Biodiversity and Resource Monitoring Program and oversees the establishment and implementation of several marine conservation projects at Dakshin's field sites, such as the community led fisheries management in the Lakshadweep, citizen science programs in the Andamans, and long term monitoring of coral reef ecosystems in the Andamans. He has served on the editorial board of Current Science and as an invited member to the Aquaculture and Marine Biotechnology Task Force of the Department of Biotechnology, Government of India. It is my great pleasure to invite him to speak in the June edition of Sprouts Environment Trust's monthly lecture series.
Thank you, Rahul. Welcome, Naveen, and thank you so much for accepting this invitation. In the audience, we do have Vardhan and Chetan, Abhishek Jabalabad. So a lot of people from the field are, attending today. Your colleagues as well. So welcome and over to you. Just a request to all the audience members that as we always have, please type your questions and comments in the chat chat window, and we'll take all the questions at the end of the presentation. So over to you, Naveen.
Yeah, thanks, Rahul, for that introduction, quite elaborate introduction. And Anand, yes, thanks for flagging that there are lots of people here who are from the sector, who work with marine systems. So yes, now I'm a bit nervous. I thought I could get away with whatever I would say, but now it's a little bit, stakes have gone up a few bit more. Yeah, so I'll try and do justice to what I've been asked to do today. And so, as Rahul introduced me, I'm a marine biologist, so that's where and did a master's and PhD in marine biology, and got hooked to the ecosystem, and then started working on not just studying the ecosystems, but also and the various species, the diversity that you find in oceans, but also then got it involved in their conservation and all of that. So that's how I am where I am, in the sense that I started off with a lot of interest in the ocean and the various life forms in the ocean, which got me very excited, particularly the invertebrates in the ocean systems, which generally get very overlooked. Uh, so I thought I was in fact struggling to kind of construct the talk and see how it will kind of cater to the varied audience and age groups that are assembled here. So what I thought might be useful is to try and understand the oceans from a system perspective rather than break it down to specific ecosystems and look at it ecosystem wise. I think, which I will try and give you a glimpse of, but the larger objective is to try and see oceans as a larger system, as not just something that's of interest from a biodiversity perspective or for its aesthetic value, but look at it from all other potential, you know, or whatever one I could conceive of, the different ways people look at oceans and understand those systems as well. So I will begin with my slides. Yeah, so I kind of titled it Joining the Dots, the Physics, Chemistry, and Biology, but actually there is one more component I would have liked to add, which is, and I am adding, is the people's aspect of it, and how humans kind of interact with the marine system as well, because that's very critical to understand in the current day and age. Yeah, so yes, I can hear my kids shout in the background. I hope that's not too distracting.
No.
So yes, a lot of us do know that oceans are probably one of the harbor, one of the most not just one of the most diverse, but also probably one of the most oldest form of lineages of various life forms. And I'll talk about the diversity, particularly the species level diversity. At the macro level, the diversity in the oceans are extremely high compared to, probably in terms of actual numbers, it might be lesser, but in terms of the phylogenetic or the species level diversity, it's actually quite huge. And yeah, so you all know how it all started, right? 4.5 to 5 billion years ago, the Earth forms, and then about 3 billion years ago, first life forms come in the oceans. Small cells, prokaryotic cells, and others, and then later, about 2 billion years back, there were the first, eukaryotic cells, the ones with nucleus and all of that had formed. And then for the longest of time, life was confined to the oceans. And, if you look at the time scale and look at when life started colonizing land, it's actually very recent, if one may say so. It's say around 350 to 400 million years ago that life from the ocean slowly started colonizing land, and it provided a lot of opportunities to find new habitats, new niches, evolve accordingly, evolve, go extinct, and then again evolve and go extinct. So oceans to a large extent have kind of stabilized in terms of its, the diverse niches that, when I say niches, the various habitats that different, groups of organisms could occupy. But on land, it's still quite a, ongoing process. And, there's a lot more different habitats and niches that are being more and more colonized, So that way, land is a lot more. The overall message being that, the life forms on land as we see it today is a lot more younger than what happened in the oceans. There are quite a few land, organisms that manage to, and even ecosystem builders like seagrass and others that have managed to evolve on land and then have moved back to the oceans. But then those are very limited. The number of species that have managed to go back to the sea from the land, right? And like I said, it also harbors quite a lot of phyletic diversity. Here, these are mostly all the major phyla, not including a lot of the minor phyla that are also mostly restricted to the oceans. But from parazoa, the one that you see on the left is a tiny, unicellular form called choanoflagellate. That's the most ancestral form from which most of these different diversity that we see now kind of originated. So from there, it became, very loosely arranged kind of organisms that are called sponges. A lot of you would know them. If you do remember your biology or still doing your biology, they're generally called poriferans. They are probably one of those initial forms where many cells came together and started forming a proper organism of sorts. So that they're one of the most primitive organisms and still very very diverse and very common in the ocean systems. Pretty much all ecosystems will find representatives of poriferans there. So, and then from there started on another kind of tangent started the truly tissue formation kind of started. In sponges, it's just a few cells coming together and performing different functions, but actual form, organs and specific tissues being formed for specific purposes started with eumetazoans, and then they kind of diversified into radiates and bilaterally symmetrical organisms. Radial being the ones that are radially symmetrical. So basically, you cut them across the center on any axis, you get two identical halves, and you don't get that with bilaterally symmetrical organisms, which means you can cut them only in two, through the central plane. If you cut humans, you can cut me from head to my toe through the center axis, and you get two identical mirror images of each other. So that's broadly how it kind of diversified. From there, it's interesting in the oceans to note that a lot of these traits are not so, so concrete, in the sense that bilaterally symmetrical organisms sometimes do exhibit radial symmetry, like what you call the echinoderms, for instance, right? A starfish, if you look at symmetry in starfish, as larvae, they are bilaterally symmetrical, as juveniles, as young ones, but once they become adults, they become radially symmetrical. So you see a lot of primitive, or what are assumed to be primitive traits in organisms kind of repeat itself quite often in the marine system, which is again something that I find quite exciting, is how do these things happen? How are these traits that are generally discarded through selection processes and not considered a great character to have, a great trait to have when you're evolving, sometimes those things keep repeating over and over. So that's something that one gets to see quite a lot in the marine systems as well. If you look at the overall global biodiversity, Earth kind of land has the maximum diversity in terms of absolute numbers, right? But more than 80 to 85% of that is contributed by one species that's the arthropods, right? The insects that we find on land contribute to the maximum diversity, right? And very interestingly, you don't find insects in the sea, except say the ones that live on the surface, like your water spiders and some insects that you find in aquatic systems. In marine systems, you do not see insects that live in have like full all their life history spent in marine systems. There are a lot of theories about that, which I'm not getting into. But the other key thing to notice is, when you look at the other forms, there are about 23 phyla that are generally called as the minor phyla. Some of them have been reshuffled and rearranged more recently. I'm not completely up to date with that, but still there are quite a few, at least at one point there were at least 23 minor phyla, and nearly all of them were found only in the oceans and not found on land. So that's the kind of, broad level diversity that you find in the oceans, right? And you don't find representatives or equivalents for them on land. And that's something worth, that excites me at least. And these organisms are not found restricted to, certain areas. The entire ocean is, as they say, 75% of, the surface area on Earth, planet Earth, is occupied by oceans. And in that, these different forms of these different groups have kind of evolved to survive in different systems, and each of those systems have their own limitations and their own pressures that they put on the organisms that live there. And if you look at the basic classification of the ocean, most of what we know or study, at least me as a marine biologist, have access to a lot of it, is unless there is like enough facilities to go and explore stuff deeper in the water. Most of the studies are confined to the 30 to 40 meter depth. That is like a very, very, very small portion of, and that too very close to land is where, most of the studies are done. And that's pretty much where a lot of the biodiversity is concentrated, because, oceans in general are what you call, what's the word for it? I forget, but they're nutrient deficient. So, they do not have sufficient amounts of nutrients to support plants, or what you call the equivalent of plants in the sea, from where the food chain can begin, and, smaller to larger organisms can live there. So the base, which is the production part of it, is very limited in the ocean in many parts, because nutrients in ocean is very limited. And all of it has to come mostly from land or through other processes where the ocean, brings up the nutrients from the bottom of the sea, right? So that's how these, so most of the oceans are devoid of, many life forms, but they are present, but in much lesser numbers and much lesser densities, and, have their own unique adaptations to survive in those areas. And most of our activities as humans with the oceans are also quite strongly confined to the up to the what you call the continental shelf, which is usually around the 150 to 200 meter depth. Normally if you go from the shore all the way to the sea, once you go a certain distance, your depth suddenly goes beyond, 150 to 200 meters. Beyond that, it's assumed that, the ocean falls very rapidly to much deeper, to deeper waters. And I think the average depth of the ocean is around 3,000 meters. That's the average depth of the ocean. So, we're talking about, so most of the 75% is actually more like a desert, right? And it's not just flat, it's also three-dimensional. So we're talking about, diversity. Talking about looking at systems, vertically as well. And what is the main factor? One of it is the light, which is basically needed for photosynthesis. Most of the primary production happens because there's light available and photosynthesis is possible, which is why most life forms are restricted to the 200 meter depth range, beyond which the light level decreases significantly, usually to the 100 meters. In some areas, they can, some wavelengths of light can go much deeper, like blue, which is why the oceans are blue, by the way. So, so quite a lot of these, and as you go deeper, you get more and more pressure. Every 10 meters, it's like 1 atmosphere is added to your back, right? It's like carrying 1 more atmosphere's pressure. It doesn't feel much at shallow depths, but even while you're diving, once go beyond 15 meters, 20 meters, 30 meters, then your amount of time you can spend in those depths are very, very limited, because the amount of pressure that, the water exerts on you. So this is at 30 to 40 meter depth. Imagine at 3,000 meters depth, what would be the amount of pressure that comes on you, right? So there's a fair bit of limitations. Only if you can adapt to those pressures and those limitations, the absence of light, the absence of food production, all of that, can you survive in those deeper areas. I'm going to restrict most of my talk to the littoral and, sublittoral area, which is confined here to the 30 to 40 meter depth. Yeah. And water as a medium has its own limitations, right? Especially in the ocean, salinity, the saltiness of the water is a serious, limiting factor, which is why most of the organisms you find in freshwater cannot survive in seawater, because they cannot adapt to the higher salinity that's available there, and vice versa as well, right? So water as a medium has light, pressure, and all those other physical kind of limitations that it puts, but also in chemically there's the pH of the water, which is how acidic it is or how alkaline it is. That determines who can live there, who cannot live there. Like I said, nutrients come from the land, so all of that is also very critical. Unless you have nutrients, you don't get primary production, and if you don't get primary production, you don't get elaborate food chains forming and diversity kind of accumulating in a particular area. And then there are other factors such as oxygen and light and density that I talked about earlier, right? So the long and short of it is that water is there everywhere, but not all of this water is available for organisms to go and live, right? So it's like there's so many different things that act as limitations to who can live where. A couple of critical things I thought I'll just flag them here. One is the especially when you look at it from the physics of the water, of the ocean's point of view, the nature of water itself is such a way that once the temperature is higher, that's pretty much the same with any matter in world, is with more temperature they expand a lot more and they're less dense, right? The gases, if you heat, they expand and they become less dense. The same way water also does expand and contract, and it leads to what is called density dependence. Density dependent variations. So the surface area up to 200-meter depth usually is like quite well mixed and receives a lot of sunlight. It's warmer, but then once it goes beyond a certain level, there's a sudden decrease in temperature. So as you can see there, from say 30 to 35 degrees centigrade, some average is about 28 degrees centigrade. It goes all the way down to 3 or 4 degrees, and I don't know if this is something you get in school physics, is that water is it's densest at 4 degrees centigrade, right? It's not the densest at 0. That's another very critical component of water that makes your icebergs float. All these various characters that water exhibits is also because of those physical properties of water as well, right? Why does it matter for the organisms? Because what it forms is something called a thermocline, or what you call a pycnocline. Because the temperature is decreasing, the salinity is decreasing, the water becomes much denser. So you get a layer of water below 200 to 300 meter depth that is very dense, and it forms a barrier for many organisms to move up and down, right? Most of the ocean life, especially the smaller planktonic forms which form the base of the food chains, cannot move beyond this depth, right? Because there's this real strong layer called thermocline or a pycnocline that prohibits them from moving down. Why it matters in recent years is because of, I don't know if you all have heard of dead zones or oxygen minimum layers. There's increasing reports coming that there are big dead zones forming the ocean, that there are areas where there's no productivity, fish dying, or a lot of marine life dying and all of that, with literally no life in those waters. And a lot of that comes because of the fact that this excessive nutrients coming in, excessive plant and other planktonic form coming in, and they all, when they die, they kind of get trapped in this particular layer because they're so small that they don't break these layers and go below. So you get a lot of organic matter accumulating between this 200 to 500 to 800 meter depth range. And in that range, increasingly, oceanographers, people who study the oceanography of it, the physics of it, the chemistry of it, they're finding it that these layers are expanding a lot more because there's a lot more of this accumulation happening. When these things accumulate, dead things accumulate in this layer, it uses up oxygen because it's anaerobic processes. And when decaying happens, there's a lot of oxygen that's consumed and it's not produced. So you get oxygen deficiency, and they're called oxygen minimum layers or whatever in more technical terms, right? So increasingly, this is being recorded more and more. In Bay of Bengal, there's a massive plume of dead ocean, that seems to be expanding every year. And people who are studying it have said this is going to be the next biggest challenge for, oceans in coming years, right? The other critical thing about oceans is not just about the water, but how the water interacts with the air. And air-sea interactions are again something that oceanographers study a lot, right? And why is it important? Because that's critical just for human existence, as simple as that. If these things don't work properly, climate change, all these things, El Nino, whatever, storm surges, all of these things, you hear about low pressure areas forming in, out in the sea. What are these low pressure areas? It's basically, areas where the water heats up a lot more, and then air tends to go up. As I said, when it's hotter, the air tends to become less dense, and then it goes up. As soon as they go up, the air from the nearby areas tend to replace it, right? And this is there naturally. The way oceans work, they have at the equator where the sun's energy is the highest, you usually have low density areas, right? And then you get higher densities towards the tropics. And from there, towards the temperate areas. And from the temperate areas, the winds start blowing towards the tropical areas. And that's usually, and then when the earth spins, that wind is kind of deflected by another force called Coriolis force and all of that. But what happens is there are winds blowing in a particular direction. And for the longest of time, all trade in the world, all ocean navigation, exploration, all of that was dependent on the directionality of these winds. And people have studied it so much that, all trade, everything, economics, everything of the world used to be dependent on these things. Our spice trade, our silk, or whatever, all other kinds of trade that happened with the Middle East, with European countries, all of that worked entirely because of these systems being quite predictable, right, at this particular time. The only difference is monsoon, which is a bit of an outlier, which hits India quite often. And even now, I'm guessing from what I hear from Anand, Mumbai is getting a lot of rain and all of that. So if you look at that, that's a bit of a different process where the wind blows from the oceans northwards. Usually it all blows southwards in the northern hemisphere and northwards in the southern hemisphere. But monsoons blow the other way around because the Himalayas and the high ranging areas of north and central India get heated up a lot more during the summers, and that creates a low pressure area which makes the wind blow from the moisture laden wind blow from here to there, and then it hit Himalayas, and then it comes back as the northeast monsoons and all of that, right? So those are all our entire survival, mostly in India, is dependent on those monsoons, right? So this is where our interactions with the oceans become even though it's not obvious to someone who's living very far from the oceans, but the fact is that it is very tightly linked to what happens out in the oceans as well, right? And there are lots of currents. These winds, when the wind is blowing over the oceans, large bodies of surface waters are dragged along with it, which leads to what you call the current system, right? Here, if you see, all the red color currents are the ones that are the warm currents, and the blue ones are the ones that are the cooler currents, right? So if there is no landmass, this current would have been flowing, in a circular direction around the earth. But because there are these land masses that deflect these currents in different directions, it leads to a pattern of, a long-term pattern of how these things interact. What's happening with climate change is that these patterns are all getting disrupted more and more. The predictiveness of these, currents or the wind directions is all going a little haywire because of these different changes in the climate anomalies that is leading to what is called as climate change, right? So this is important. Like, for instance, the Gulf Stream, a lot of work has been done on the Gulf Stream. A lot of people have, talked about it a lot as well. It's a warm water current. It's the reason why many of the northeastern parts of the North American continent is livable. There are these other, and then that warm current reaches all the way up to Scandinavian countries. So, Iceland, Sweden, Norway, they're all habitable because these warm water currents go all the way from here to there. And so, our basic survival is also very tightly linked to not just the winds and the rains and all of that, but also to the, oceanic currents that are constantly kind of in motion in the oceans, even now as we speak. Yeah. So along with that is what you call the thermohaline circulation. This is not entirely wind driven. This is also driven by what I talked about, those density differences and all of that, right? So usually when the surface warm waters reach colder areas are mostly along the North Pole, because there's a lot of land kind of converging those warmer currents towards the North Pole. What you find is they get cooler, right? And when, like I said, when they hit 4 degrees centigrade, a large part of the water sinks. And the Northern Atlantic is actually much shallower than the rest of the ocean. So what happens is this water that sinks to the bottom, because of the topography, it starts flowing all the way down, right? And some of it, and this is entirely because the ocean bottom topography is very different. So it goes all the way here, it hits the Indian Ocean and, at the Indian landmass and other landmasses here, the shallower areas, the continental shelves and all of that. And then they come up similarly, another, cold water current goes all the way up to the North American, the Northern Pacific, and then becomes warmer and then comes all the way back. So there are these larger, what you call thermohaline circulations also in play, not just the surface currents, but these vertical currents as well, which are also again very critical. They're called the global conveyor belt is what I think it's called. And this is also slackening. Its pace is decreasing. Its predictability is decreasing increasingly because of people who've been studying it for more than a century now actually are finding that, these thermohaline circulations are also changing significantly in the oceans. And these have huge implications for, life on Earth itself, not just for us as humans, but generally for life on Earth itself, right? That's mostly the physics of the oceans. And like I said, to a large extent, it's these different patterns, the way the ocean is dynamic, and our understanding of those dynamics is what drove human development to a large extent. In more recent years, it's become, with more mechanization and engines and, better ships and all of that coming, a lot of those, restrictions placed by the ocean has been overcome. But generally, it's still the primary medium for moving all the nearly 90% of the goods that we trade globally is being moved through the oceans, through these large ships, right? So sorry about that. Sorry. Yeah, so there are all these, so there is a strong reliance on oceans as well, just to run our economy as, different nations. More than 15 trillion US dollar worth of commodities apparently is what is traded in a year. This is a few years back, I think. I think, yeah, at least, 8 to 9 years back. It must be much, much more in current years. And it's also a space that provides a lot of different services, right? It's also something where the people who live on the coast have depended on the resources, on the things that the oceans have to offer for survival, right? It could be people just going off and picking off things which you call a subsistence-based kind of dependence, which is just go there, take stuff that you need on a day-to-day basis just to survive, and bring it back, use that for your nutritional needs and all of that. And to a large extent, that's how, for the longest of time, that's how our dependence on the oceans used to be. But then with more and more access to ocean through, better navigation, through better, port and ship facilities and all of that, things change. The scale of operations change drastically, right? So from there, and it's not just for stuff to animals to eat, but also plants and other things. There's a seaweed extraction from, southern, central Tamil Nadu coastline, along the Gulf of Mannar and Tuticorin and all of those areas where people extract a lot of seaweed, which goes into, pharmaceutical companies. Different kinds of products are made from that. People depend on small things like, shells and other things which have value as curio items and things like that, things of ornamental value and stuff like that. It's also a space where people do collectively work together, right? Like, I don't know if you all have seen those rampant nets and all of that operate along the Malvan coast and the Mumbai coastline and all of that. And then there are similar kind of practices pretty much everywhere where fisher communities are present. And just to give you an example of, give you an understanding of the scale at which things happen. I mean, at which these things are at present happening in the country is there's a fishing village every 3 or 4 kilometers, right? That every 3 or 4 kilometers you go, there's either a small fishing village or a fishing hamlet where people depend on these resources. So, their entire survival, their identities, all of that is kind of linked to these resources. And they see oceans very differently from how I see. Like for me as a marine biologist who freshly, was so excited about all the marine forms, understanding how people look at these systems differently was actually quite a revelation. To know that there's no just one way to look at systems and understand it, but it's like a much more interdependent system where people engage with it on a day-to-day basis, right? Not just look at it as something that's of aesthetic value that needs to be completely protected or conserved, but look at it as a resource that will provide basic, life support for you, livelihoods for you, something that can be used sustainably or something that can be, look at it from a utilitarian perspective as well. And there are others who look at it from a, curiosity and scientific perspective. There are others who look at it much differently. Oh, this is like a government might look at it as, oh, trade. This is like key things. We need more ports. We need more things. Development on the coast, more infrastructure to facilitate, a lot more trade, and we need to route all our trade through our country. So there are different ways at looking at the same space and engaging and understanding it and engaging with it, right? And it's really important for all of you to also understand that it's not just the way I see it, but there are multiple ways to look at a particular space or a particular system, right? And then things kind of changed. The scale of operations changed in the late 1980s to 90s, when the big industrial revolution happened in the European countries, and in the US. There was a lot of mechanization that happened, right? And along with that mechanization came ports or different things that operated at an entirely different scale. It provided, it helped the fisher communities who depend on these resources on a in a very quick time of span, their scale of operations kind of changed a lot, just because they had a machine and a motor to run their vessels, and they had like all mechanized systems to catch fish. And we became more and more efficient at removing things from the oceans, like taking things out of the oceans, and without a sustainability concern in it, right? Without putting in systems in place that would ensure that these things are available for future generations of not just us, but future generations of fishers themselves, right? So it became like a race where if one builds a slightly bigger boat, you have to build a bigger one so that you can access much farther off, get more resources. Then it became a race of sorts, right? And then the scale of operations changed. What you see here are mostly trawlers, one of the more problematic kind of fishing operations that are happening currently, not just in India, globally as well. They mainly targeted these resources called shrimps or jhinga, different names in different places, but there was a pink gold rush that happened at a particular time. Going out and harvesting these things brought in a lot of returns for fisher communities. But what it also meant is that it led to a lot of fishing as an operation. Many operations are non-selective, especially if you're using things like a big net and removing things out of the ocean. They're non-selective. They can't pick and choose, right? So trawling is one of those most non-selective gears, such as what it leads to a lot of extraction of what you call bycatch, which is not trash fish, or different names were given to it. Now that has also changed. if you have questions, I can talk about that later. But so what you see here is just the number of rays that have been landed on one particular day in one particular fish landing center. They're not the main target that the fishers go out to harvest, but these are mostly incidental catches that come along with it. They are accidental catches, right? And people find ways to make some revenue out of it as well, but quite often it's very wasteful. Yeah, that's with fisheries. But then that's not just the only thing, right? Like an industrialist, if they look at the oceans, how do they see it? As at the coast and the beach and those spaces. For them, it's like great places. Ariva, let's set up a industry here. Why? Because it's so much easier to let all your effluents and things out into the sea. The amount of costs or investment you need to put into just dealing with the amount of waste or toxic products that come out of your industries, so much easier to dispose of them if you're building your industries closer to the oceans, right? So that's another pressure on the coast. You're talking about this thin fringe that's forming the margins of our land, and the entire area is being competed for heavily, right? And there are barely any strong regulations in place. There's one regulation called the Coastal Regulation Zone Act, CRZ, which is the only legal instrument that controls what can happen and cannot happen on the coast. And that law, since the last 20, 25 years or whatever since it's been drafted, has been amended more times than the number of years it's been in existence. And most amendments, when I say amendments, change. Most of these amendments are actually dilutions of that law to facilitate more and more growth on the coastlines, right? And it's industries is one, and it directly creates a problem for the people who are depending on it as well, right? While the benefits are being reaped by a small group of people who run those industries, the costs of running those industries are being distributed to the people who use those spaces for their day-to-day existence, right? And then the new thing is the tourism boom along the coastline, right? Beaches are great places to go and hang out during your holidays. So that is not my restaurant, sorry. It's just the names are similar. It's not my full disclosure, but there are these constructions, and so from a real estate point of view as well, it's huge demand, right? Housing colonies, housing units, all of that in Mumbai, you might see, right? All the prime real estate is along the beach, right? So it's huge demand from the real estate and real estate lobby as well. And generally, it's also the only recreational spaces available for coastal people, right? For people who live along the coastlines, and those areas are getting more and more segregated out, right? How many people can go and generally run a big fanfare along the most posh beaches of Mumbai and whatnot, right? There are lots of, and along with it comes very different social kind of spacing out of these areas as well, right? So there are lots of different ways one can look at the oceans. They're not just spaces that are of aesthetic value, but also spaces that have a lot of utilitarian values as well in different ways, right? Right. So I'm going to move on now to the systems itself and back to the oceans and marine systems where I started, right? So why do we need to look at marine systems differently? Why are they different? Can we not just use the same things that we use for terrestrial systems, and that like protected areas or species protection plans or um, specific species recovery plans and things like that? It's a lot more. There are lots of things that are being tried and attempted in the terrestrial system. Can we not just use that for the marine systems? But it's not as simple. There are systemic differences between these two, and I'm just going to talk about a few of those that matter, especially from a conservation and a management perspective for these oceans, right? And first and foremost is what forms the base of the food chain. What is it that forms the base of the food chain on land? It's plants, grasses, right? And they generally have a lifespan of at least a few months to many, many years, right? And those, if you look at the standing product, organic, presence on land, it's much higher. The plant biomass is much higher. But if you look at the oceans, the biomass are lower, but it's much more dynamic, right? The base of the food chain are formed by these organisms called phytoplankton, right? They are basically plants that are very microscopic. You need like really high power microscopes to see them, to kind of study them as well. And these tiny phytoplankton form the base of the food chain. And there are different organisms, similar tiny organisms, microscopic and others, who feed on these, right? They're the only ones who can feed on these plankton, and they form the second big, level in the food chain. And like that, so phytoplankton forms the base of the biomass in marine systems, and that makes a huge difference, right? And then they get eaten by a lot of organisms that you call the zooplankton, right? It could be a larvae of a large tuna, or the larvae of a small mollusk, or a small shell like a bivalve or a gastropod, some small shell as well. All these larval stages depend on the phytoplankton initially for survival, right? And then or some of them eat the zooplankton that eat the phytoplankton as well. So there is a what you call plankton in ocean is both phyto and zooplankton, and both of them pretty much form the basis of the food chain, right? And one other thing, since I'm talking about zooplankton and larval stages and whatnot, one other thing to also understand about marine systems is, first of all, it's fluid, right? So you don't know where the boundaries are. Like you can draw clear boundaries around the forest, but where do you draw the boundaries around a coral reef or a seagrass ecosystem? You really cannot mark out an area and protect it and expect it to survive just because you're protecting that particular patch, because the dynamics of the water that connects these different systems are very different. It's like the air that connects different forest patches, right? Imagine if you could move through the air from as a deer or as a tiger or as an elephant. If you could use the air to move from one forest to other, the way you would look at those systems would be very different, right? But in oceans, that level of dynamics is there, and that connectivity is always there between different systems, right? And different patches as well. So for most marine organisms, I think more than 85 to 90% of marine organisms have what you call a larval stage in their life history, right? It's basically as soon as you're born, either from a red egg or as a small individual, you are a larvae. And these larval stages are very different from the adults. And why do they produce these larvae? The theory, to a large extent, has been to, one, get away from pressures from your own adults, because after you are very densely populated in a certain area, you cannot go and survive in that same area because it's already occupied by different, well-established adults. So you need to find a different patch to ideal habitat to go and settle and survive. So they've given these larval stages, when nature has given them these larval stages that help them, move and, kind of spread to other areas. And what's exciting about these larval stages is that it's very different from the adults, right? The first one that I have here is of a, sea star. And see, this is what I meant by bilateral symmetry. And when it becomes an adult, it becomes radially symmetrical. Similarly for, annelids, that's an octopus larvae in the adult, that's a snail larvae, cone snail larvae, and its adult. So they're very, very different. And even though the adult can't move, they can't move long distances. Like a snail is called a snail space, you call it snail space because it's very slow, sedentary and sessile life forms, right? Many of them are attached. Corals are completely attached as adults. How do they move from one area to the other and propagate and colonize different areas? Is through these larval stages. And again, this has implications for how you manage systems in marine lifestyles. That's again an oyster. Just to give you an example of how it happens, right? There are these tiny eggs that come out, they fertilize, and then there are these tiny larval forms, and then once they are ready to settle down on the ocean floor, they find a good place to settle and then become an adult, right? So, but they are, if you look at an oyster, you might wonder how is it going to move from one area to the other, but as they do it while they are, in their larval phases, right? And it's not just the larvae themselves kind of living in the, dispersing in the oceans by themselves, they are carried around by, this is just the Bay of Bengal on one particular day in 2014, there you have the date there. And this is how the currents in the ocean looks. This is a much more fine scale one. And if you zoom in more, you will find that it's much more complicated, right? And as a larvae, they're not swimming ones. What these larvae are, they're basically plankton. They cannot swim on significantly on their own. They are just carried by currents in different directions. And when that happens, they ride these different currents and reach different areas. And that's how they disperse and propagate and colonize new areas. So in the marine systems, the range, the amount of area that a particular species can occupy can be much, much higher than what it is on land, right? And in the land, it might be confined to a small patch like a forest, but in the sea, it's much different. Right? They have different processes of doing it as well, external fertilization and all of that. And talked about the food chain as well, right? The food web in different systems. It's much, much complicated in marine systems. So there are phytoplankton and then zooplankton that eat the phytoplankton, and then slightly larger zooplankton that, predatory zooplankton that eat the other zooplankton. And then, ones that eat the zooplankton, like whales might directly feed on krill and other zooplankton and survive, but there are others that feed on the fish that feed on the zooplankton. So it's much more complicated in the marine systems, where as in the terrestrial systems, it's usually a tree or a grass that, the herbivore is there, the primary producers being the tree or the grass, and then the herbivores. And there may be a secondary carnivore, a secondary and a tertiary carnivore involved, primary, secondary, or a tertiary carnivore involved. But that's as much as it goes. It is not as complicated as it is in the marine system. So if you remove a shark, for instance, it releases the pressure of all these other species that it feeds on. And what it does is their populations increase, which means it puts a pressure on the level below it, right? Their populations go down. So there is like a cascading kind of an effect when you pull out a particular species, an important species from the food web in the marine systems, it's so complicated that you can't predict the impacts of it so easily as, say, removing all the tigers from the ecosystem. And that the number of gores or the sambars or other prey species will go up, and the plant diversity and, the amount of greenery in the area will go down because there are no predators. It's very predictive in the terrestrial systems, but it's not as predictive in the oceanic systems. And land and sea are also very strongly interconnected. Like I said, most of the nutrients come from land, but many other things, many other ways, land and sea are very strongly interconnected, and that determines what happens in the oceans quite an extent, right? So even the sand that comes from the land, it's important for the beaches to form. Quite in lots of places you see beach erosion happening, seawalls being built, and then further more seawalls being built, rocks and mountains being broken down and brought to the sea, and just to kind of buffer the coastline, right? More often than not, it's usually blamed on sea level rise and other problems, but quite often what happens is, no one is looking at it as a larger interconnected system. You build a dam somewhere upstream, you're choking the sand and sediment that's supposed to come and replenish the beaches, right? Or if you remove all the mangroves that trap all the sediments and the silt that's usually then slowly kind of released to the system, you're again going to get a lot of impacts on the coastal and on the coastal ecosystems, right? So there are quite a lot of interconnectedness between land and sea, but it's not that they're entirely separate systems. Yeah, that's just a distribution of marine diversity, global distribution. And as you can see, it's all very close. Wherever there are land masses, the diversity adjacent to it is quite high. And this is quite, and once you move towards the outer ocean, it's usually seen as, more like deserts, right? The amount of diversity there is actually much lesser. So every, grid that doesn't have a landmass associated with it, you'll see is much lesser diversity compared to the ones that have landmass associated. Yeah, I'll quickly run through the ecosystems as well. Like I said, I'm going to restrict myself to the continental shelf area and the nearshore ecosystems. The one that we all have quick and easy access to are the ones that are called the intertidal systems, the ones that lie between the high tide and the low tide. They're the ones that are called intertidal systems. And that's another regular process. People who live on the coastline will understand how these things work, right? It's like the ocean breathing. Every day there are two high tides and two low tides. And there are lots of different organisms that live in those intertidal areas. And they are adapted and, in various ways adapted to live in those intertidal systems. And they are interesting because they have excellent adaptations to live in that system, right? Something that they're between land and sea. So they need adaptations that let them survive on land, but also when it gets submerged during the high tide, they need to have adaptations such as those, right? And these are generally what I've categorized as the borderline systems. The sandy shores, most people don't see or acknowledge them as, systems that have any biological value, but they are quite, diverse as well. Then there are systems like the sand dunes, rocky shores, estuaries, and mangroves, right? So estuaries are the places where the fresh water, the rivers and the sea meet and kind of form brackish water systems. Sandy shores, again, quite dynamic. It erodes, it forms, it erodes, it forms, usually, which is why you need to give coastal areas a certain space to kind of play out its own dynamics regularly. Once you go and build in those areas, you kind of interfere with that dynamics. And sandy shores and, sand dunes are also of much value to people who live there, right? Like this is from Tamil Nadu along the Coromandel coast, somewhere where people have located their houses on top of sand dunes so that, when tsunami and other kind of, major storm surges and other disasters struck the coast, these sand dunes kind of offer them a lot of protection against. From I think this is from near Velankanni, near Nagapattinam, where this is what you see is agriculture, paddy being grown here, very close to the sea. Right there is the sea, and these are sand dunes that were man-made, and because they are these agricultural communities, they've actually used the leaves of the palm that you see here, the palmyra leaves, and kind of trapped sand and built these sand dunes over decades. And because of these sand dunes, they have a lot of fresh water available in those areas, and they're able to do agriculture right next to the coastal area. So they provide a lot of other services as well. In the foreground, you see in the bottom the kind of vegetation that grows primarily on sand dunes and help trap the sand on the oceans. Different charismatic species, that's the leatherback turtle that you find in the nesting in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. They use these beaches. Many other turtles and many other species use the beaches as nesting grounds as well. Lots of interesting taxa found. It's a mole crab, worms and other critters, mostly mollusks and others that you find on the beaches if you know where to look for them. And then there are the rocky systems, right? On a sandy ecosystem, you need to be adapted to constant movement, right? Every time the wave hits, you're getting thrashed, and then so you need to be more dynamic and very fast. You have adaptations to dig, adaptations to sail, float, survive among the sand. In other places, for rocky systems, you need adaptations like that help you cling onto it, right? Here you can't dig into it so easily, but you need to be able to cling onto it and feed and do all your things without getting washed away when the waves come in. So rocky systems are also quite exciting systems. These are barnacles that you see in large numbers. There are two species. These are what you call the Tamulus barnacles, and I think this one is called Tetraclita, not mistaken. And what you see is a gastropod that's feeding on it. So these are not, when you see a rocky ecosystem, it might look like very slow and not very exciting, but actually it's quite exciting. Things happen slowly. You get a lot of time to sit and observe. They're not running away anywhere. You can see them. What this gastropod is doing is it's feeding on these different barnacles, and you can see some of them are alive, but a lot of them have been already predated upon. And this kind of leads to a lot of interspecies dynamics, and a lot of our understanding of ecology has been based on people who first studied these rocky intertidal systems, right? Concepts of and you can see interesting adaptations as well, how behavioral, interesting aspects about their behaviors as well. You can see limpets, these different kinds of limpets that are kind of positioning themselves to shaded areas, because if you're positioned somewhere here, you're exposed to too much of sunlight and you get dried and desiccated. So they also, within the rocks, there are lots of interesting things that one might find if you keep an eye out for those patterns, right? Where they're present, what is it that they're doing, are all quite exciting. Similarly, those are barnacles who are smartly settled on top of the predator itself, which means, they form good ways. You can see things that eat all the things that grow on the rocks and form depressions and cavities and all of that. These are what you call chitons. Like I said, exciting places to explore and learn a lot more. I'm not going to get those. And then there are the mangrove ecosystems where the freshwater and the seawater makes, these are the only group of plants that have adapted to, that have, trees that have kind of adapted to grow in this particular kind of landscape / seascape, right? Where when the tide comes in, seawater comes in, saline water comes in, when it recedes, they get exposed and there is more fresh water and all of that coming. So it's quite an exciting system. Various, species are specifically evolved to live there. These are, Terebralia gastropods that basically feed on all the litter that falls on the mangrove floor, and they kind of quickly turn the biomass into actual animal biomass, plant biomass into animal biomass. There are very interesting species like the mudskippers that can survive outside water but also need to be near water. Interesting personalities a lot of them have, exciting, and they are active predators as well, if you observe them. And they're all very easy to observe because you can walk in when the tide goes out and you can sit there and observe them for a fairly long period of time, right? Fiddler crabs, mangroves provide, habitats for lots of juveniles, right? When you're small and easy prey for other larger adults, it's always easy to go and find refuge inside mangrove systems. So the presence of mangroves on the coastlines do provide a lot of other services as well, right? And a lot of exciting other species like the monitors, water monitors, and others that you see in those mangrove patches, right? It's quite exciting spaces to study and learn as well. I saw Chetna somewhere here. I think it's her senior batch. Yeah, cool. So, and then there are the truly marine systems. These are the ones that live in that borderline between land and sea. And then there are the true marine ones. The one being, the seagrasses, for instance, are one of those species, like I said, one of those very few plant species that have managed to come from the land back into the sea, right? They are basically grasses, monocots that completely evolved on land. And then from there, they slowly managed to kind of colonize the sea and perform various and kind of do the services of ecosystem generators, like form the basis of a lot of separate seagrass ecosystem in the oceans as well. Different kinds of species grow there, lots of blennies, goobies, and others that you find there, like specifically adapted to seagrass meadows. This is again a picture of Vardhan, who's been studying dugongs, which are basically the only large mammals, again a species of mammal that has adapted to live in the sea, come from the land and then colonize the sea, right? And they feed particularly on this particular seagrass, only on seagrass for for their food. And most likely that it kind of those interactions kind of co-evolved as well. There are green turtles also that feed on seagrass meadows. And then there are the reef ecosystems that that always creates the kind of kind of factor. But again, see, coral reef ecosystems are compared to tropical evergreen forests, extremely diverse, different kinds of life forms, colorful. The one on the top right is a small branching coral that has bleached, right? And all the others are basically living in symbiosis with algae that live inside them, right? So you do get to see a lot of similar interactions as well. They form big structures. It's not just that the corals and the obvious things that you see on the reef, But what they do provide is this incredible complex habitats within which various other species can live within. Right? It's like a big metropolitan city, right? With all your apartments, all your different small houses. Coral reefs are pretty much similar, right? The three-dimensional spaces that the live and the dead corals together provide is just that habitat itself has huge value, right? Not just the corals that live there, right? Different forms of corals, just to kind of give you. I've been studying corals in the Andamans for a while, so some of the people here in this group have also been involved in looking at coral reefs in the Andamans. There are also other kinds of you know organisms that live, sponges that I talked about in the beginning, poriferans that live along on the basically the dead coral substrate is not a it's not a useless thing. Once the corals die, it kind of opens up space for, in just the small frame, you can see how many different species and taxa are kind of competing with each other for space, right? There are tiny algae growing there, here and there. There are, other kinds of bryozoans and stuff in between. There are sponges, there are gorgonians, what you call sea fans. There are some hydroids I can spot in between. Just one small area can provide, habitat for a lot of different species. So space, the real estate value on reefs are actually much higher than what you probably see in Mumbai for that matter. And then there are other kinds of coral-like forms that also provide the kind of substrate and services that like these that are found on sandy bottoms and stuff. There are soft corals and other forms. Like I was saying, it's not just what you see outside when you look at a reef, but these dead substrates or even the live substrates many a time are drilled and bored through. And this is something I studied for my PhD as well. When folks ask, what did you do for your PhD? I used to say, I studied boring organisms. So folks used to say, hey, come on, man, marine systems, reefs, how can it be boring? So this is what I mean by boring, is that they actually bore through the corals and create so much of three-dimensional space. So if you take a dead reef coral, I'm not saying all of you should do it, but if you actually break open a dead coral, you'll see so many things that you don't see outside, right? Incredible diversity, from tiny worms to shrimps to crabs to sponges to all kinds of things that live inside it, worms. So it's not just what you see outside this. I think it's assumed that more than 80% of the diversity of reefs are what you call cryptic fauna, which is living inside the structures, which you don't see when you go out on a dive or walk through through shallow systems and whatnot. And they're not just species just living and doing their own things, but there are lots of interesting evolutionary and behavioral adaptations, which are called the symbiotic relationships between different species, right? The most popular being the clownfish and the sea anemone, but there are various other forms of symbiotic relationships as well, right? That's a blue streak cleaner wrasse, if I'm not mistaken, that provide services to other species. There are places called cleaning stations on the reef. You just go there and stand, even as a diver, you just go there and chill out for a few minutes. You get these fish coming and cleaning you out. They get their food, the parasites are removed off the fish. So there are lots of these interesting symbiotic relationships that are formed over the years. That's a hermit crab and the anemone where sea anemone, where the hermit crab carries the shell, and then you get all these other different kinds of anemones that live on top and get carried around wherever the hermit crabs goes. These are the coral polyps, like a magnified version of the coral polyps, the tiny things that make the corals. And inside them, you see the algae, right, that give them the color. You're partially bleached, but you can still see a lot of the unicellular algae are present there, right? Yeah, so I'm going to wrap up with this. I'm running short of time as well. I think I already overshot my time, so I'm sorry for that. But just to quickly summarize, oceans are valuable, like we saw, in many different ways, right? They pretty much are critical to our survival. What happens on the oceans is very important for not just humans, but for the entire planet in a way for its own survival, right? And they provide a lot of different services, economic, livelihood, and in various other ways. they are not the same as, they're not as straightforward and simple as the terrestrial systems. Like I said, they have all these different traits that make them distinct, entities, or distinct, from a system perspective, they're very different. Even as biological systems, they function very differently from, say, on land. So you can't just think that whatever we do on land, we do on sea, in the sea, and things should be fine. You need an entirely different perspective and understanding of how systems work. And then land and sea, usually for the systems that most people engage with, involved with within the shallow areas, land and sea are very tightly interconnected. And we also kind of quickly looked at all the different forms of ecosystems in the marine systems, a very quick glimpse of those. But I'm happy to take questions if you have more questions, and whatever I can help with, I'm happy to answer and take those questions. I think there are, thanks to all these people for those, for the images and illustrations. I've shamelessly plagiarized from the internet as well, so please do. Apologize for that, but I'm guessing I think I've tried to acknowledge as much as I can. Yeah, that's it. So I'm happy to take questions, Anand, and others.
So I think take a sip of water and catch your breath. There are a bunch of questions. So yeah, I'll start with, I think, the first one is two very similar ones. One by Rahul. 1 second, I'll just go up. Okay. Okay, the first one is by Rahul Palekar. His question is, I read somewhere that all the body plans and structures of marine creatures developed during the Ordovician period, and they've remained largely the same ever since. Is that true?
I don't think for all the marine creatures. I think it's primarily for a lot. During the Ordovician, there was a huge what you call a boom in marine taxa diversification, and different taxa getting evolved and kind of establishing themselves. So it's like the golden era of sorts for the marine systems. But during which period a lot of the different larger taxa level kind of evolution happened, but I don't think all of them have happened at the same period for all marine creatures. For most of the the lower phyla, because it all simultaneously happened, they do have quite a lot of similarities in terms of the body plan. But for the larger chordates, say for instance the fish and other kinds of chordates and all of that, it all happened during multiple periods of the evolutionary time scales.
So the next question is by Sid, and very similar to what Rahul has also asked. Are Thermos, Halo, and pycnoclines absolute or seasonal? And I'll combine that with what Rahul has asked. That he's saying, are melting icebergs, as the icebergs are melting, they reduce salinity of the ocean. So are the pycnoclines going to increase even more?
I think the first question is, about, those are averages. There's no absolutes to any of this. This is very variable from, different oceans to different. Even within Indian Ocean, there is so much of variation in terms of where the thermocline is. In fact, thermocline is not so obvious in tropical waters. It's actually much lower and much deeper in tropical waters. It's more prominent in the as you go further north, this becomes more and more temperate waters. It's very, these different density layers are much prominent. But it's like I said, it's not consistent. These are generally averages that people are taking for. It's not like absolute that after 100 meters you get a pycnocline or a thermocline. Doesn't happen that way.
There could be a vent which could also change.
When you go to the deep sea, vents can have some influence on the temperature of the waters and stuff like that. But given the volume of water that's present, in those deeper waters at 4 degrees centigrade, it's actually doesn't make too much of a impact to affect the temperatures at a global scale. The other part of the question was with the melting
basically climate
iceberg.
change and melting
Melting
icebergs.
icebergs. Yeah,
And salinity also changing, basically. Will that
I'm sure salinity would be
create a...
changing, and I'm not very. I really do not have a. I'm not aware of, or rather, I don't know is the better way to say it, is that I don't know if it actually, what is the level of impact of it, but there are definitely, concerns. Sea level rise is one, but if it is producing volumes of water that can affect, the level of sea at global scales, I'm guessing it does have a strong impact on the salinity gradients as well. But I really do not know much to answer that question. I'm very sorry. I can look that up and answer later if that helps.
Sure. So we can share your email address also, and people can, you can send references, or we can also do that if you send it to us. So next question is by Vishruta. I think that's going to probably open up the discussion a little more. What is the scope of sustainable aquaculture in replacing temporary or permanent fisheries, and how practical is it in the Indian context?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, because aquaculture basically means that you're culturing or basically rearing, various marine forms, right? And how do you rear it? You need to have a space for it. Most of the aquaculture that happens currently is on land, so you basically modify coastal areas and use that space for, for rearing your organisms of interest, right? And quite often you only do it for organisms that are of high commercial value, because you're not going to invest a lot, buy a big plot of land, dig up a pond, and then grow something that's of no economic value, right? You want to grow things that are of the highest economic value and do it at the most profitable level, because aquaculture is a high capital in enterprise as well. It's not something that a small fisherman can do and become a billionaire out of, right? It doesn't work that way. So you really need to have high capital. The way aquaculture is being done currently, or is being promoted currently, it's capital intensive, which means, and then it is resource intensive. What do you feed these things, right? You need them to grow fast. Where does the feed come from? So I talked about trawl fishing being a very wasteful practice, right? It used to be a wasteful practice for the longest of time. In the last 15 to 20 years, what you used to be called trash is not trash anymore. People are going out to collect things that are just alive and bring it all out, because it's all going to feed manufacturing companies who convert this into food for aquaculture, for organisms that are reared in aquaculture. So when these things are promoted, even by the government, when these things are promoted, it's being the premises on which these are promoted is as something that will, address poverty in India, something that will address nutritional insecurity of coastal communities. This is how create jobs. This is how these initiatives are largely promoted. But honestly, it doesn't do any of these things. It will ease pressure on the natural resources because you're culturing them. This is how it's promoted, but it doesn't do all of it. Unfortunately, the way it's being done right now, it doesn't do, because it's all for capital intensive. So no poor man can do aquaculture, or needs land, or needs to have all of those, right? Secondly, it's not relieving pressure off the marine systems, because like I said, all the feed and all of that comes from oceans. Everything that used to be bycatch and thrown. So trawling would have been economically unviable 10, 15 years back, because shrimps and all of that, the amount of shrimp you get when you go out and trawl is actually very little. It doesn't even break even for fisher community, for a trawl boat owner to operate a trawl, if not for all this bycatch having a value. So now what people are doing is biomass fishing. They just go out and take anything that has biomass. So it doesn't matter what it is. It could be juveniles of really high value fish like seerfish and pomfrets or Bombay ducks, or it could be their babies. doesn't matter. And it's all sold in kilograms, right? So aquaculture, the way it's being done right now, it's not a sustainable option to replace marine fishing. And it doesn't replace, it doesn't let fishermen move to aquaculture. Only big investment people, new players will come into that sector. It's not easing out pressure in
Also,
any way. Yeah.
it'll also affect the agricultural systems, paddy and other things. There'll be salt ingression into those areas also. So those systems also will probably get degraded.
Those problems are the other additional whatever bonus problems that you get along with it. But the basic things or tenets on which these things are constructed are actually not true.
Vishrita also wants to know what is the source of your current data for Bay of Bengal, water data. I think climate data is what she's asking.
Climate data, water data, there are multiple sources. If you want climate related data, oceanographic data,
she's asked water basically.
So inquiries, if you want temperature, salinity, surface currents, all those kind of physical aspects of the oceans, you get it from this site called Incoys that makes it available online. Like one of those complicated current maps I showed for Bay of Bengal was from the Incoys website. If you are good with GIS and all of that, you can go there, you can download it, you can use the data. I think the format in which it's downloadable doesn't let you work with it. So you still have to get in touch with those departments. But that data is supposed to be available publicly, and it is available publicly. The format you'll have to figure out how to. Right, and other kinds of information is all there in different literature. So many marine journals are there, Indian journals, foreign journals. There are enough you want information, it's all available there. Whatever your interest is, you can go and look up. There are many research institutions in India. India actually has some of the most pioneering research institutes globally as well. We were actually the best marine biology institutions and oceanography institutions were in India. So we have a huge heritage and volume of work available. Just have to go through those, and I can direct you to those.
Yeah. Another loaded question by Anjali Pujari. How effective is conflict mitigation in terms of coastal conservation in India, especially considering the gap existing between fisher communities and marine conservationists?
Yeah, good question. I mean, a big problem being, one of the fundamental problem being the cut, copy, paste approach that we follow. We just conveniently, we have a few tools for managing natural resources. One is declare them protected. So basically nobody can, like, fortress models of conservation, right? Set aside area, throw people out, don't let anyone, like, make them inviolate spaces. That's one model that we've looked at. And the other is very species centric approaches, which is, go out and declare a species as protected, and then, nobody can touch it, right? If it's Schedule 1, then you're looking at, tiger equivalents in the sea, right? There are seahorses. There are many species of snails that are Schedule 1. Sea cucumbers. I don't understand what's the logic of making them all Schedule 1 and threatening a fisherman who by accident might catch it. There are people who catch it intentionally, who very well do these things through well-organized, networks and stuff like that. So basically things have gone underground. Otherwise things would have been much more prominent. The only way you can do it is through strong regulation in marine systems. And if you want to do or build bottom-up processes, like engage with communities, look at these as a different systems, a use-based system, and not take models from the Western world and try and apply it in contexts like India, where things are very, very different. You can't use those similar models of Yellowstone Park in places like India, where the level of interaction culturally, identity wise, there are so many complications to it. So look at other models that one can work with, and not try and implement those models. So there are fundamental problems. Marine resource use is managed by the Fisheries Department, which used to sit under the Ministry of Agriculture and all of that. Now livestock and fisheries have become a separate ministry. And there is their protection. Their management is sitting under one ministry. Their protection is sitting under another ministry, which is the Ministry of Environment and Forest. these two ministries don't speak to each other. One is putting their laws left, right, and center, and the other is promoting fishing by giving better boats, giving better, nets and all of that. Where is the conversation happening? So unless, things are systemically sorted out, these things are not going to bring in more and more stringent regulations. Will only escalate conflicts, and rather than, and nobody talks to fishermen. No, nobody even bothers talking to them before bringing in any laws, right? It's not like every fisherman wants the ocean to be completely wiped clean. It's their own livelihood. But who's talking to them? Who's talking about ways to manage it better? Nothing is happening. So how do you, unless all these things are changed, I don't see a future for marine conservation happening in spaces like this.
So Santan is asking, what is known about the site fidelity of egg-laying leatherback and green sea turtles? What would happen when there is suddenly a loss of 35 to 40% of egg-laying beaches in previous known sites and the overall population over generations? What would be the impact?
Specifically for leatherbacks?
And green sea turtles. What do we know in terms of their site fidelity? And if the
Site
beaches are
fidelity.
lost, then what?
Yeah. So site fidelity, there's a lot people know about the site fidelity in turtles. Not just turtles, many other marine organisms do have, advanced taxa do have very strong site fidelity. And turtles, unfortunately, need to come on land and specifically use beaches, sandy beaches in particular, for nesting. And leatherbacks in particular have requirements also. The beaches, they can't just go out and nest on all beaches. The way most of the nesting beaches, at least right now in India, the only nesting beaches are restricted to leatherback nesting beaches are restricted to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Most of those beaches are quite unique in the sense that they are places where there are slightly larger rivers or, small perennial streams that come and, open out to the sea. So not like large delta systems, but smaller kind of delta systems with beaches, large beaches, deep approach to that bay. That's usually how leatherback turtles and olive ridley and leatherback nesting kind of overlap significantly that way. But olive ridleys can be much more generalist, but leatherbacks have very, very specialist nesting. Have very specialist requirements for the nesting beaches, which means the amount of nesting beach available for them already is very limited. They used to nest on Indian mainland. In some places, there are records of leatherbacks having nested long time back, but no more. So with lesser and lesser beach spaces available, obviously, it's going to affect the leatherback turtles. In many places, in say Malaysia, for instance, it's come down from 1,500 to 2,000 nests to 4 or 5 nests in a year, on many nesting beaches, and don't know where those turtles went because it's really difficult to track them and understand. So when we did our tracking in the Andamans, the leatherbacks that nest in Little Andaman, one of the beaches where we surveyed, studied them regularly, they go all the way up to to Madagascar and Mauritius and all the way there from Little Andamans. And another group went all the way to the northern coast of Australia and all of that. So that's the level of use that they have, and then they come back exactly to the same beach to nest. And if those beaches are not there anymore, what exactly happens to the turtles? Probably they find other beaches to nest in, nearby beaches. I don't know if they can move all the way from, say Little Andaman to Great Nicobar and find another beach, but it's possible. I really do not know. I don't think that has been recorded much. If anyone here can clarify, that's good. But most likely that those nesting beaches are gone, it's going to affect the nesting population significantly. And even if they go to other nesting beaches, there are already turtles who've been using those nesting beaches for a long time. They're not going to be nesting beaches that are just available freely. So there will be space crunch and all of that.
Are there any studies which are indicating that there are turtles which were nesting at a certain site which got destroyed and they moved to other areas for nesting? Is there evidence?
Because of destruction, I do not know, but there are tagging studies, even our own, that shows that they can shift between different adjacent beaches, and
Right.
but do not know how far that, how elastic or how plastic that fidelity is. Ideally, I would like to come and nest on the Little Andamans. It's not there now. Okay, let me go to Malaysia. I don't think that level of adaptations are there, because we're wired in a certain way.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Naveen, because of your expertise, the questions are really like going from ant to elephant kind of size. So next is to corals now. Corals are said to be very sensitive to temperature changes in the ocean, but they evolved during the Cambrian period and have survived several mass extinction events and even ice ages. What could be the reason behind this? Could it be that those species were resilient and today's species are not? This is Rahul's question. He finds it quite confusing as to.
Yeah. No.
Do you think that these species will also be resilient to it, or?
I don't see any reason why they won't, provided they get enough time to adapt and and modify. They have survived long enough, and it's not going to be easy to wipe out the entire, all the different species of corals that are surviving in that are currently existent. There might be certain species that are way more vulnerable to temperature differences and don't have like so much of a whatever range of temperature tolerance. But but it's very, like in Lakshadweep, our colleague Rohanatha has been studying bleaching for a very long time. There are these lagoons which are very shallow areas in which there are corals, and then there are the reefs outside which are more deeper and exposed to the open ocean. So the temperature inside the lagoons are always higher than the temperatures outside, because that's the open ocean, and this is like a confined water body. The corals inside the lagoons are doing much better than the corals outside when when say an El Nino event or something happens. So the same species of coral. So I think they are able to withstand temperature differences, provided that temperature difference is a little bit more gradual. They have time to acclimatize, they will acclimatize, and they are very. That's the advantage of being primitive, is that you get much wider, tolerance levels and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think we should be more concerned about ourselves than the corals.
Yeah. So next question is by Amruta. He said recently she came about the idea of coral restoration. So what is your take on coral restoration? Yeah, please have it.
I mean, things have changed over the last couple of decades in terms of restoration itself. But when it started off, restoration, I would say, was a very wasteful process. Especially in resource crunched countries like the Southeast Asia, Asian countries, South Asian countries. Usually reefs and developing small countries kind of overlap very strongly. Mostly all the natural resources are now left in the world only in, areas like ours, because all the others have managed to clear off their own. And, when you have these kind of systems, and when you want to recreate, you can recreate. It's like planting a few trees and assuming that the reef is recreated. That doesn't happen, right? It's the same logic, right? If you want to recreate a forest, that's a different thing altogether. And recreating coral reef ecosystems is not a easy thing at all. It's not just about putting a few structures in place and recreating those spaces. There are artificial reefs that people have tried in many places, which probably provides substrate for a lot of species that normally wouldn't be available. But it's still, now there's evidence that it is actually contributing to the productivity of the ocean, not just aggregating everything. Earlier, what literature showed was that it just acts as an aggregator for all the fish which would otherwise be free swimming, and making them more susceptible to fishing and easier targets. But now it's being shown that they do use those artificial reefs to, kind of recover and rejuvenate. And like in afforestation initiatives, you always have preferences for what you want to plant, right? You always plant trees that are fast growing, that shows canopy very fast, that creates that space very fast, but you're not actually contributing, you're not recreating a forest by that. So to actually, so most reef restoration initiatives focus on branching corals, especially acropora, because it's easy to break them up, stick somewhere, and then let them regrow. And so then you end up with big restored patches of acropora, and it's like having a lot of acacia plantations in a particular area. Or what I mean, not acacia, but some indigenous species that you planted. Just it becomes like a
Teak plantation.
cluster. So now things have changed. I mean, having said that, things have changed a lot. Initially, it was not the case. Now I think there are much more, with technology, people are finding out ways and letting other species of corals also kind of reproduce. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. We are at 7:40 and there are about 10 questions, really good ones. So we'll, I think, probably keep the answers a little short now because really interesting questions are coming up.
Yeah.
Vishrita has asked this: what is your opinion? The best way to include our small scale fishermen for sustainable management in the ocean, so benefit their needs, and your opinion on circularity, concept of circularity in ocean fishery management.
Concept of circularity is a bit tricky because what you give back to the oceans is only by way of managing what you take. I think that's the only way you can give back to the oceans or ensure that it's not getting polluted and affected a lot more. But the question about how do you involve small scale fishermen and all of that, you need to engage a lot more. I mean, right now most of the localized management systems have all broken down. Traditionally, fisheries used to be managed at a village level. There may be flavors of caste and religion and all of that comes in, but still management was happening at a more decentralized level. Once it all became a centrally managed kind of resource, then it became open for all, right? No one particular village or no one particular community had access over a particular land. So you need to now look at not entirely bottom up, but looking at ways in which you can get fisher communities also participate, not just as passively extracting fish from the ocean, but actually contribute to its management. That has never been attempted because again, we've happily copy pasted Western ways of fisheries management, which are completely incompatible with fisheries management in India. So you need to look at other ways in which co-management frameworks. There are various different frameworks that are coming up, ecosystem level management and all of that. So hopefully, and the National Marine Fisheries Policy now identifies these kind of approaches as being important for the future of fisheries management in India, which are all positive signs. But let's hope, these things do play out in intent.
Yeah. So I think there are two slightly hypothetical kind of questions. One is from A. Iyer. What's the possibility of many more Great Pacific garbage patches? So is there possibility of plastic eating organisms to evolve in this system? That's one. And similar by Gangotri is that if open oceans are deprived of nutrients, then what could be possibly the factor that caused early ancestors of whales and dolphins to return back to oceans?
Sorry, I didn't understand the nutrient and the whale.
So if the oceans were so nutrient deprived, why did the terrestrial mammals go back and turn into whales and dolphins in the evolutionary?
So I'll take this question first and then the other one next. So in terms of nutrients, yes, land is one major source of nutrient, but there are many other sources of nutrients also in the ocean, especially in the southern ocean and all of that. A lot of these different places, you have these periodic upwellings. So basically deep water, cold, nutrient-rich waters from deep in the ocean due to various reasons come up. And this happens in, along the Peru coast. It's quite a common phenomenon where the anchovy fishing is like a very, very big industry, one of the largest fishing industries in the world. And the entire biomass of anchovies comes because of this upwelling that happens periodically. So it's not entirely that, it's nutrient deprived, but there are still the space that whales occupy, I think, is like the large herbivore space, which was not primarily occupied. There weren't enough representatives of that, if I am correct, and if my memory serves me wrong. I mean, correctly, I can't remember any, large herbivores that were present in the ocean. And I think that's where some of that niche that say, the dugongs, when the seagrass came in, the dugongs, kind of moving into the oceans, or with other larger mammals moving into the oceans, is also their ability to access, like, whales are special in being, at least most of the common whales which feed on zooplankton and, smaller fish, have developed those mechanisms by which they can, you know, accumulate so much of biomass without spending too much energy. And if that energy dynamic didn't work out, I don't think they would have evolved into, successfully survived in the ocean system. So krills, blue whale can eat tons and tons of krill in a day, right? And that mechanism, I think, kind of helped them facilitate, survival in the oceans, which I don't think any other marine organism is the equivalent of that. Right? That particular niche was not occupied for a very long time. Yeah. Guessing
And in
that's
terms of
more the
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 Great
other question.
Pacific garbage patch, that there could be evolution of plastic eating organisms in the
I wish
ocean.
there was, yeah, but I don't think evolution kind of happens in those tiny. If
That's
what we've learned from, from experience and our understanding so far, expecting evolution, there is microevolution and all of that happens, but will that happen at a pace fast enough to kind of deal with the plastic problem? I'm not certain. I don't think so. Maybe later on, when
so.
this world oceans are only left with big piles of plastics, probably we might have some of them come. Yeah, sorry, move on to the next one.
Yeah. So Nairika Barucha has said that she liked your comment about real estate value of coral reefs, and she also had a question about the ethics and aesthetic aspects of coral restoration, so reef restoration. So I think you've covered part already earlier. Yeah. Priyanka has asked, would not aquaculture lead to various diseases? Do marine ecosystems also have a possibility of pandemics, dangers of diseases in the ocean?
I'm sure there are concerns because definitely, but and there are definitely diseases that have gone into the marine systems from, large scale, high intensity aquaculture and very bad management of aquaculture effluents and all of that. There have been lots of instances of marine organisms getting infected by, diseases that have come from land. But I can't think of, pandemics. We really do not know anything about marine systems to be able to confidently say whether there are pandemics. There have been instances with some, like, urchins in Hawaii. A lot of them died out because of some disease that hit their populations, and large populations were wiped out. But again, because their densities became extremely high because of fishing pressures and other problems. But pandemic level, we really have very little information. I really don't have too many examples or information to talk about that. Yeah.
Right. Sorry. So I had 1 second. How vast will be the damage by releasing radioactive waste water into ocean by Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant in Japan?
Well, quite intense it could be. There's no question about what radioactivity can do in the oceans. I mean, there are enough examples like the same Japan examples and stuff like that. But I think its level of spread can also be quite high because of water as a medium and whatnot. I'm not very sure. I'm just taking an educated guess there. But there are lots of instances of radioactive, exposure, radioactive dumping of materials and all of that having severe impacts because it gets absorbed quickly at a plankton level and then quickly magnifies itself along the food chain. So and especially given that we eat larger fish, we are also placing ourselves at, endangering ourselves by exposing marine organisms to, radioactive elements. Yeah. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's the best I can do.
Yeah. No, I think given the fact that we are ourselves creating so many nuclear power stations all along our coastal areas, I think it's a matter of something that one should be concerned and should be part of our discourses.
Absolutely.
At least at the community level, whether they are aware of what the impacts would be on their.
Oh, those kind of impacts are actually much more severe because it's direct exposure for local communities, right? Even if it goes through the effluents and stuff like that. Not even nuclear things, other industrial pollution and things like that. There's a lot of cases happening. Things don't get the limelight or the attention of media because those are not convenient conversations to be had. But that is happening everywhere, and the impacts of Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Mumbai, Maharashtra, and many places in Maharashtra, there have been severe conflicts, including deaths.
So I had a personal question, and we've seen three cyclones this year, and we don't know what speed of what is the impact that especially all our island systems and the coastal communities. How do you think that they were designed, or are we involving our communities in safeguarding themselves against the cyclonic activity? Maybe the East Coast has had a history of that, but now we're seeing it in Gujarat, in Maharashtra, and so many other parts which have not seen so much of strong wind movement. So, is Dakshin involved in something like that, or what is the kind of resilience mechanisms that they should be working towards, according to you?
On multiple fronts. So, coastal protection itself is, is something that is a complicated. It's not straightforward, but it's a little bit of a problematic thing because, say, for instance, when the tsunami hit in 2004, lots of coastal villages along Tamil Nadu were very badly hit, and in the name of giving them their vulnerability, the fisher communities prefer settling very close to the oceans with a view of the oceans, because that's how they understand that engagement is really, that feel is very critical for their survival, and that's how they understand and engage with the oceans. To move them away from the coastal areas was actually in the name of vulnerability. New settlements were provided further away from the coastline, but what it did is it didn't protect the coastline. It just opened it up to another form of colonization. It just got taken over by industries. It got taken over by highways. It got taken over by infrastructure. All kinds of things which actually have much severe impacts on the coastline than a few small hamlets surviving there, right? So those are so I think we really need to, it's a matter of intent, no? It's only during these conversations, these meetings, that we all talk about it. But nobody really talks about this. Once this meeting is over, we're all back to our own things, right? It's there, but it's their survival question, and I think one needs to put people in the front. And it's a rights question. It's not an ecological question. It's not just an environmental question. It's a basic human rights question about what are you doing to the coastline? Is this even done? Are you in the name of safety, relocation, and all? There are enough rules that were put in place, at least to some extent. Some legal instruments were put in place. Consistently, every government has come and diluted that entire thing. And what is the point now complaining about? And like I said, not understanding things systemically, right? Easy to you blame everything on climate change because you don't have to take any responsibility. It's the most convenient thing to put every garbage under, is say it's because of climate change. What can I do? You build a dam upstream and choke all the sand, or so this thing, fresh water that's supposed to come there. Mangroves in Sundarbans are not growing properly, not because of sea level rise. It's because of fresh water from Yamuna and all the three rivers not coming. Enough fresh water is not coming. So why are you surprised when all these calamities happen? but the level of storm surges and all of that have increased a lot in the recent years. The frequency and the intensity has increased. So at least now, if we don't take action and cognizant action and understand, that these things are very critical, and you're also investing in infrastructure there are millions of rupees being invested in infrastructure and all of that, and you're going to do that in a place that's so susceptible and vulnerable, and further making it more and more vulnerable. These are questions that people have to ask at the higher level, and be honest and upfront about it. I don't see that happening. Yeah.
So I have, I think the last question is that, like we've seen the rights-based issues that are happening where, indigenous communities are displaced out of protected areas. So when marine conservation and marine protected areas are coming in, do you think that's going to create another similar situation where, we create marine national parks and sanctuaries and displace all the fishing communities? Already the catches are reduced and we are going to make them into inviolate, so-called inviolate zones. Is there a possibility of something like that happening? Or do you think in the marine spectrum, there is much more inclusivity or there is much more stakeholder discussions
It's
and
no,
education that is
I mean,
involvement?
things are happening in different worlds altogether. The Ministry of Environment, it has commitments on in CBD, whatever CBD 14 is, whatever life underwater, they've committed, signed up for certain amount of areas to be declared as protected areas. And it's being, I'm not averse to having protected areas, but do it in a way that it's ethical, it's done properly. And it doesn't have to be completely no-take areas. No, in fact, this is where things could be learned from the West. Is there are in many other places there are protected areas which are managed areas. They're not like completely don't even come near this area, I will shoot you kind of areas. There are areas where people can manage. You can extract things. You set quota systems, sit down with the community, say, given the long-term things, what are your demands? How much do you need? What is the access you need? Can we work out a system in which we can do this together without going down there? The problem is there's only one hammer and everything needs to be, or one square peg, and looking for all kinds of holes are being filled up with these square pegs. So that's the problem. The fundamental problem is people are not ready to push themselves beyond their comfort zones. It's easy. Scheduled bana do, protected bana do, fir mera khatam.
So biosphere reserves or community reserves kind of could be more engaging and
those
more
models
inclusive.
should be explored, and should be explored much more in earnest, and do that in an earnest way, not in a way to just check boxes. That's not the purpose, right? As long as you're just bothered about checking boxes, then things are not. Anand, I'm sorry if you can't telecast this on YouTube. You feel free to whatever.
No. Oh, this is absolutely. We've had far more what you call volatile discussions and comments, but this is very safe. No problem.
Sure.
Yeah. So over to you, Amrita. Yeah. Amrita, you're on mute.
So I'd like to thank Dr. and exposing us to such multiple layers of oceans and like putting in the aspects of physics, chemistry, community all at once. Also for the work of Dakshin with the coastal biodiversity and community, I would like to thank that, and also a special thanks to Manvi Kulshetra, Anurag Shankar of FES for co-hosting this session, and Rahul Palekar, Dviti Das, Siddharth Varadkar of Sprouts team for supporting this. And sure, a special thanks also to the lovely audience for having listening for so long and having a engaging Q&A session.
So, Naveen, can we share your email address with the audience? Some of
Absolutely,
them are
yeah,
to get
you
in
can.
touch with you.
Yeah.
So you can also definitely go to the website of Dakshin, and you can get contacts from there. But request Amruta to please put your email address. So thank you so much,
Yeah.
Naveen, and thank you to the audience. And next month again we have another fantastic talk which is planned up, but I'm not going to be disclosing that now. But what again, more and more every speaker, whether it was Archana Godbole last time or Dr. Naveen Namboothri this time, is saying is that community engagement, all the different stakeholders, the government agencies, and two arms, there is a industrial arm, there is a business arm. All of that has to sit together. There has to be conversations. You can't work in silos, and one building, giving clearance, making ports and making jetties and things like that, and the other talking about a marine conservation area. You can't have olive ridleys nesting if you're going to give out a huge project right over there, or building a dam 100 kilometers up on land. That definitely has an impact on the ocean systems also. So I think, like a human body system, we have to have these things connected together. My request to all the audience members is that if you can at least write a paragraph or two of what was the takeaway from you, because listening to these lectures, I feel that if you can summarize it and put it out to more people to think about it. I think what is happening is we are listening, we are accumulating, but we are not processing it and sharing it with more people. I think, you all also have to be now the multipliers, as I would like to call it, or influencers about these things. So, yeah, the oceans have been fascinating for me constantly, and we've been engaged with it. I always tell people that Bombay is a group of islands. Islanders think a little more conservatively. We are not like mainlanders. Unfortunately, in places like Bombay, we have the whole mainland model, as if there is no roof to how much growth we can have. And I think it's a very, very bad model to take. So I think the whole coastal zone needs to take a very, very conservative thought process, and maybe step back, like we are talking about carbon, emissions going back to a 350 unit. We need to probably pull back a whole lot more on our destructive thought processes. So thank you, Naveen, once again, and have a good
Thanks,
weekend, everybody.
Anand. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks everyone for sitting and listening. I can see a lot of thank yous on the chat. So yeah, thanks
Yes.
everyone. It was
Yeah.
I enjoyed the session myself as well. Listen,
Yeah.
it's actually quite painful listening to my own monologue, but there was slow, dull voice. But
No,
yeah,
but
I
just
think
to
it
give
was
you a
quite.
backdrop, we
Huh?
have the youngest member that I can see and recognize as a 7-year-old child to college professors and researchers, etc.
Yeah,
from the team. So there's a huge spectrum of people who have attended the session. So
absolutely. Yeah,
that's great.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks
Thank
everyone.
you.
Yeah, thanks Anand for the opportunity. Yeah.
Very pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.
See you everyone. Stay safe.
You.